second section of this book, that is section 2, Civilization, chapter 6, Bharat, Coloniality and Colonial Consciousness. Now the author starts by telling us about Bharat and how it is actually not approached with the same colonial lens, but given the lot of evidences that the author has given us in the subsequent in the previous chapters, it should be approached with the same colonial lens, especially given the intercastra, that the papal that was issued by the Pope, wherein the Portuguese and the Spanish countries were asked that they had to convert other religions to their own ways of life and their own universalizing ideas. The author states that even in Bharat, mercantile interest was there, but conversion was also one of the goals. That was, the Europeans had this idea that it was their moral responsibility to educate the natives of Bharat to their ways of life and their particular OET system or their religious systems. Hence, a decolonial approach is necessary to understand Bharat also, because even in present day, this inherent colonialism which still exists in the consciousness of Bharat and its people perpetuates this idea that without the colonizers coming into India or Bharat, there wouldn't have been any sort of development that would have taken place. Furthermore, without the Britishers creating a sort of a nation state, there wouldn't have been all of the units or states of Bharat uniting into a particular country. Now, this does not take into account the shared interests of Bharat and the long-lived history which Bharat has shared together with all of its various state apparatus and various people. So this decolonial approach is necessary to reclaim the agency of Bharat and its people and the Indic ideas. With that, we come to the first subsection of this chapter, which is colonial consciousness, post-colonialism, and the natives' options. Now, colonial consciousness aimed at establishing and projecting the civilizational superiority of the West, because the apparatus and the definitions were also taken from the West. So, for example, the idea of right, left, capitalist, socialism, liberalism, and so on and so forth were apparatus of the West. They are European ideas which were basically used to project the superiority of the West. That is to say that anything that the West perpetuates was modern, rational, was superior to the ideas of the East, and even if they were acknowledged to some extent, they were termed as Oriental, and hence they were backward. Even as we have already established in the previous chapters, scientism or scientific facts were used to perpetuate the idea of racial superiority or psychological superiority, and how the natives were weak or they could not be taught certain things, they could not be modernized on their own, and things like that. Herein, the author talks about the literature of two scholars in this regard, Dr. Bal Gangadhar and Dr. D. Rover. Both of them call colonialism an educational project. That is, an educational project which masks the mind of people and makes them view things in a certain way, which is perpetuating the idea of this colonial consciousness and the superiority of the colonial project. Because through education, you can shape the minds of individuals in a particular way. This educational project was used to create the perception of Bharat as a weak and servile civilization, which was only there to serve the interest of the European colonizers, and it was conquered in the first place because of its inherent weakness. And all of these ideas were perpetuated through this educational project of colonialism. Now, this subsection is concluded by the author telling us that what is the relevance of this discussion. Even Dr. Bal Gangadhar and Dr. D. Rover's literature is cited in this regard. Firstly, he tells us that an acknowledgement of moral responsibility of colonial consciousness has to happen. That is to say that the Western countries or the colonizers have to acknowledge this fact that colonialism still exists in the countries that they left it, and it is still having a lot of impact in those countries. And even the free people of these countries now, or the native states, even these particular institutions have to acknowledge this fact that they also have either consciously or unconsciously furthered the interests of coloniality or colonial consciousness. They have, through the apparatus left by them through West, or through the education systems left by them through West, have continued to further this colonial consciousness rather than targeting it and reclaiming their Indic consciousness or their indigenous interests. It is also important that through this uh, decolonial exercise, an understanding of the origin of terms like secularism, which is used to criticize their own culture, and its Protestant Christian origins has to be established. So, for instance, these Western ideas like secularism or other ideas like modernity, rationality, which are used to criticize the culture of the native individuals and their own indigenous faiths, that has to stop happening. And that reclamation agency can only happen when the terms like secularism are put back to where they came from, which is their Protestant Christian origins, which is their religious origins. And if religion is being used to criticize their way of life, then that should not happen and that should be stopped. And this acknowledgement has to happen. And thirdly, hybridity is also talked about in the relevance of this discussion. Now, hybridity, according to the post-colonial school and decolonial school, varies considerably. The post-colonial school acknowledges hybridity as a form of as a good practice, wherein the Western civilization and the Indic consciousness intermingled together and created some new culture or new things. However, the decolonial school calls it a simple mimicry, because once you accept the Western ideas and once you create an hybridity, you strengthen the original ideas of the colonizers that without our ideas, your institutions and your people cannot survive. You also strengthen the idea that all of the post, all of these countries, without the colonizers, the only way they can survive is through mimicry or copying the ideas of the Western civilization. So, knowingly or unknowingly, post-colonial approach only strengthens the idea of colonial consciousness and how colonialism is still being per- is still spreading in these countries. The decolonial approach, on the other hand, actively targets this hybridity and is against this hybridity, because unless and until you completely tackle the shackles of the ideas set by the European colonizers, you cannot reclaim your indigenous agency. With that, we conclude the first part of chapter 6.